All right. Guess it's a good thing that we're recording. 9 people. All right, so I guess anyone who watches it will get it. The quiz is posted. Forgot about it. Forgot to release it. I was on Blackboard, I think, yesterday when I noticed that it wasn't released. This was the quiz that finishes up the C3, C4 cam plant stuff. All right, it's a somewhat larger quiz, longer quiz, 25 minutes, because we did cover a lot of material. Make sure you review that. I think I put the deadline Friday at the end of the day. So review that material, cover it. This stuff, if we get through terrestrial, then I'll release that quiz. I'm not quite done with that quiz. I don't know if I'll get it done this morning or not. I think my video card down in my office computer is going out on me. So yesterday as I was working, the screen just goes black. I have to reboot. Found out it's the fan. So we'll see. We'll see how long it takes me to get a new one. But that quiz will go. That quiz will go live. For those of you today and tomorrow's lab, we are outside. We've had pretty decent days, pretty decent time out there, nice weather, so plan to be outside. Next week we are in the lab doing calculations and then doing some simulations. All right, so we left off here. We're talking about variation in the environment. All right, what causes environmental variation? And where we're going with this is what causes the variation in our species? Why do we see the variation across the landscape? If you look at individuals, if you look within a species, you do see some variation. Maybe variation in behavior, variation in color pattern. What causes that? Well, it's due to the environmental variation. You should kind of go back to that evolutionary ecology part and recognize that those patterns exist because of differences in fitness. And the differences in fitness are affected or determined by the environmental conditions in which our organism lives. Now, we want to know what causes those environmental conditions. What are the drivers? And we started first with temperature. So just climate in general is defined by variation in temperature and precipitation. And we started with temperature. What causes temperature differences? Well, it's largely due to solar radiation. The more solar radiation an area on this Earth gets, the warmer it's going to be. And it's kind of a mix between, you know, the angle of, let me get my mouse here. Where is it? Here it is. The angle to the sun and also day length. All right, because at the equator, those days tend to be about the same year round. All right, so you don't have periods where it's 24 hours of darkness and then different times a year where it's 24 hours of light. This is pretty constant. So we're going to be warm. We're going to have little variation in that sunlight near the equator. But then if we go up to the poles, now we have less radiation. It's going to be cooler. Average daily highs are going to be cooler. And we have much larger temperature variations themselves throughout the season, throughout the year, because you have some of those days where it's, you know, basically all night, and other days where it's all day. Altitude reflects some of this pattern in terms of latitudinal variation. So in general, if we increase our latitudes, we decrease the temperature. Same pattern arrives with altitude. If we increase our altitude, we decrease our temperature. Question is why? Well, it's a different process. As we go up a mountain, we get more solar radiation. All right, and that kind of runs contrary to this idea that more solar radiation means higher temperatures. But as we go up a mountain, air temperature or air pressure decreases. And if air pressure decreases, then so does temperature. All right, and that's a process called adiabatic cooling. Decrease in air temperature that occurs at this higher elevation or altitude. because of our decrease in air pressure. And we mentioned this whole idea of different day lengths and changes in the season, and that's entirely due to the orbit of the sun. Orbit of the Earth, orbit of the sun, all right, and the tilt of the Earth on its axis. All right, so with our tilt, that kind of generates possibilities where you can have 24-hour daylight up at the poles, North Pole during the summer, and then 24 hours of night during the winter. Water bodies affect our temperature by modulating that variation. So we're not only talking about the magnitude of our temperatures, we're also talking about the variation in temperatures itself. So in a maritime climate, we have a large body of water. That large body of water tends to regulate or modulate that temperature variation. So the diurnal change, so the daily change from day to night, is going to be much, much smaller than if we had a continental climate. All right, and we said on Monday that our area here is continental climate, and we're going to see that. We start to see it. All right, we were, I don't know what the temperature was this morning, but it was probably low 50s. I think daytime high today is estimated to be up to 90. That's almost a 40-degree temperature swing. That's a huge swing. You don't see that with a maritime climate, and that swing has to be accounted for with our species. Our organisms have to be able to deal with that, and that type of variation is a selection force. Precipitation is the other aspect of climate. So temperature and precipitation ultimately determine our climates. We're going to start with what happens at the equator, because we have this warming that happens. Solar radiation's pounding in. It's at a 90-degree angle, or approximately 90-degree angle, close to it. All right, you're warming up that air mass, and as that air mass warms, it can start to hold more moisture. All right, start to hold more moisture. But warmer air is less dense than colder air. So what happens is that warmer air rises. And as it rises, it starts to cool. Why does it cool? Why does it cool? Oops. Higher altitudes, yeah, it's adiabatic cooling. That's why. All right, it starts to cool because we decrease our pressures, decrease the pressure, temperatures also decrease, and as that air mass rises, that air mass had moisture, had a lot of moisture. But as it cools, colder air can hold less moisture, and it gets to the point where that moisture has to fall, and it falls as precipitation. So here you have this warming, the moist air rises, cools, and then it drops moisture right at that spot. That's at our tropics. It's where we see a lot of our rainforests. And it's due to this warming and then adiabatic cooling with the cold air dropping that moisture. And that's only kind of part of the story, because if we look at those air masses, if that air mass moves, then it has to be replaced. So we have this air mass here that's warming up, moving up into the atmosphere. All of that space that air mass took up has to be replaced. And where does it get, what replaces it? Other air. So what ends up happening is you get this air that's near the surface. All right, it's near the surface, it's in the tropics, it's warming up. That's where it gets its moisture until it gets to the equator and starts rising. As it rises, it drops its precipitation, and then it's really no place else to go. So that air mass then moves to higher latitudes. But not just higher latitudes. It actually starts to come down right at about the 30-degree parallel lines. All right, so at that point now we've got air that has lost its moisture. All right, it's cold, and you had air mass that was being moved to replace that air mass that was warming up and rising at the equator. So now this air mass, this cold air mass from the upper atmosphere, is going to start to fall back towards the surface. Pressure rises, air pressure increases, which allows our temperatures to increase. Warmer air masses can hold more moisture. So as this air mass falls, and we've got it coming from both sides, as this air mass falls and it warms, it absorbs moisture from that area. It sucks the moisture out of anything that's there and captures it in the air. So what do we see? Rainy weather around the equators. Desert-like environments around our tropics, our Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. All right, so that process is called mid-latitude desertification. And it's due to our air masses, and they're moving. Right, they warm, they rise. Cold airs fall. It's going to be replacing the air, and we get these cycles. We get these rotations. So a lot of our deserts are found at the 30-degree north and 30-degree south latitudes. All right, and why is that? It's because that air mass, as it's falling, as it's warming up, it's drawing moisture out of the plants, drawing moisture out of the soil, and so forth. So what causes the rise and the fall of these air masses? Differences in densities. Questions? And that's only some of the story, because this is presented as, this easy cycle, but you have to remember that the Earth is also rotating. All right, so as it rotates, it sets up these directional wind patterns. This same cycle occurs, but now we're at angles. Now you're getting your westerlies coming in, or your easterlies coming in. All right, all that's due to the rotation of the Earth. Mountains also play a role in our precipitation, and somewhat of the oceans. We'll mention those again when we get to the aquatic portion. All right. But mountain ranges affect precipitation through something called the rain shadow effect. My guess is you've seen this before, and it's probably a pretty good guess. I think they covered it middle school science. Elementary school may talk about it. But I believe middle school science is where they talk about it. And then probably in high school too. All right. So what is this rain shadow effect? It's a tendency of the lee side of the mountain ranges to be drier than the windward side. All right. So windward side's facing the wind. The lee side is downwind. All right. It's not facing the wind. And it's the same kind of process that we see here, where an air mass is going to move up a mountain. And as it moves up a mountain, it cools. And as it cools, it can no longer hold on to the moisture that's in that air. And that moisture then falls as a precipitation, as either rain or snow. All right. Now, where does that air mass pick up the moisture? A lot of times it picks up that moisture coming across the ocean or other large body of water. So it picks up that moisture. All right, we've got this, and especially if that ocean current that's there is warm, that air mass is going to be warm. It's going to have more moisture. The winds generated by our rotation of the Earth, and this sort of rising and falling of our air masses, All right. That wind's going to push that warm, moist air mass into the mountain range. And the only place that that air can go is going to go up and over. So as that moist air gets pushed up the mountain, it's going to cool and it's going to drop its rain. So now we have this cooler air mass, cooler, drier air mass, cresting up over our mountain. And as it comes back down, it's going to warm, and just like this part, it's going to warm, and then it's going to suck the moisture from the environment, suck the moisture out of the plants, suck the moisture out of the soil, and so forth. So what you end up, so our rain shadow is this side, downwind side. So if we're having deserts, not exactly at our 30 degrees or around our 30 degrees north or south latitudes, oftentimes it's because of this rain shadow effect. And we see it. We see it. We go to the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington. All right. You have moisture. Seattle rains, I don't know. I like to say it rains every day. I know it doesn't. All right. But you get a lot of rain in those initial mountain ranges, on the windward side, and then you have areas that end up being dry. So at the end of the mountains, at the end of the Rocky Mountains, what do we see there? We see desert-like environments. Utah, all right? Arizona, it's not Utah, yeah, Arizona, Nevada, all of those areas dry from our rain shadow. So can we see that? So our question, is the rain shadow effect only seen with large mountains, or can it be seen in a smaller scale in smaller mountains as well? It's typically demonstrated with large mountains where that air mass goes up, but with smaller mountains you can also get some of those things. So the Appalachian Mountains are lower elevation. You will see some of the mountains, the clouds that develop. Oftentimes if you see clouds encompassing these mountains, that's kind of what it is. Our air masses have been being pushed up the mountains, they've been cooling, and then you get your moisture. Moisture in the air can condense on those airborne particles. You can also get not quite a rain shadow, but you can see a similar process if you have the air masses picking up moisture across a body of water, and then it hits a land mass and sees rapid cooling because it came over that land mass. And then you can get excess precipitation. Oftentimes you'd call that lake effect precipitation. Oftentimes it's lake effect snow. So New York, Buffalo, New York, gets hit with a wind that's coming across the Great Lake. I think that's Lake Erie possibly. All right, picks up the moisture, and then when it hits the land mass, it cools off very quickly and dumps a lot of its moisture as snow in Buffalo. So, yeah, usually it's the high mountains, but we can also see some of it with smaller elevations. Same physics. Other questions? Mountains present another special case. Not only do they affect precipitation, but we also have variation, microhabitat variation on our mountains, and it's due to the aspect. All right, so the aspect is the direction that mountain face or that mountain slope faces. All right, so the direction a mountain slope faces. Our mountain can, we can look at the south facing, the north facing, east or west facing mountain. All right, and what we see is that on these mountains we can establish what are called life zones. All right, so a life zone is a band of vegetation associated with the specific altitude on a mountain. All right, in our life zone, the plants that are there have been adapted to those conditions, those physical conditions, so the temperature and the moisture that's present. All right, what we see is that on these life zones, we tend to have different elevation, or our banding pattern is at a different level depending on which side of the mountain we're looking at. So in general, our life zones tend to be lower on the north slope than on the south slope. And the reason being is that our south slope receives much more sun than the north slope. So in general, the south-facing slopes are going to be much warmer. So if we think back to the law of tolerance, we're going to have those organisms where that optimal zone is going to be at higher temperatures. North slope is going to be cooler. So while this life zone, we'll say the ponderosa pine forest, while our life zone can go up to higher elevation on the south-facing side, it's at a lower elevation on the north slope. And that's due to our aspect. And it's not just temperature, it's also moisture as well. So the northern and eastern slopes are not only cooler, but they tend to be moister, tend to be a little bit wetter. They've received less solar radiation, all right, less chance of drying out, so you tend to be cooler and wetter on the north and the eastern slopes. And you say, hold on, east and west, doesn't that receive about the same amount of sun? And I'd say, yeah, it does. However, the east slope receives its sun first thing in the morning. It's much cooler in the morning. By the time the west slope gets that sun, all right, it's warmer. You're going to see higher evaporation rates, which means then that our southern and western slopes are going to be warmer and they're going to be drier. And that gets reflected in our life zone. So we see these banding patterns. All right, so we've got our temperature and precipitation really going into determining our local climates. And then we have some more local things like aspect of a mountain or just the presence of mountains in themselves that can have additional effects on the climate of our local regions. Questions? Got it? I'm not going to ask you, list me the life zones. Just know the pattern, this part. All right. The other thing, so take a step back and say, why are we talking about this? Well, this presentation, this PowerPoint was starting with what determines our species ranges, right? And climate is a big driver, but so is the substrate, the soils that are in our area. All right, so the nature of our substrate is a main component that's going to determine our species distributions. It's going to be affecting them primarily through the plant communities, and then any interaction with our organisms, with our animals, right, invertebrates and vertebrates, are often tied to the vegetation that's there. All right. That substrate that we're talking about is basically the soils. All right. We can talk about the rocks, but the rocks are going to be weathered ultimately into our soils. And the soils, the type of soil that we're looking with is determined by what's called the parent material. The parent material is the rock and the mineral substrate that underlies the region. So if you take, geology, soil, you guys learned it in soils, the different soil types, and on the maps, you can see the soil maps, there's substrate maps and stuff. You can see that you're made up of different rocks, different substrates, and then those substrates give rise to the soils in the region, and those soils then determine at least partially determine what types of plants can survive in that area. All right? And the plants, again, goes back to the law of tolerance. All right? Can they survive? Is this in their optimal zone? If it's not, can they adapt to it? All right? And if they can, then hey, that's great. They can survive. If they can't adapt, then selection takes them out. So this parent material ultimately determines the physical properties of the soil. And for our physical properties, we're going to talk about the nutrient content, the texture, and the chemical content. All right, so the nutrient content and the texture of the soils is going to be tied to a couple different processes. The first are the physical forces that substrate is exposed to. And the physical forces that we're talking about are things like freeze-thaw cycles, all right, where our water can freeze and then it thaws and freeze again, and it causes the rocks and stuff to kind of break apart. You can see it in some of our roadways, well, probably not here, not as much here, but you go farther north. If you get a crack in concrete, all right, and the water gets in there and then all of a sudden it freezes. Water's a very strong force. It can cause that crack to open up, and the same thing's going to happen in rocks. And it doesn't have to be like this gigantic boulder. I mean, it is. That can be cracked like that way. But you also have to think down at the smaller scale, at the micro scale too. Where just freezing and thawing is going to break up some of these particles, cause them to be either big or small and so forth. Other physical forces are like erosion. All right, and we're talking about wind erosion. We're talking about water erosion. All right, rainfall, just running down, streams and stuff. That's going to wear on our rocks. Go up into a stream, go into a mountain stream. All right, the rocks there are going to be very different from the rocks down at a lowland level stream. How different? Well, the rocks down at the lowland have been eroded much more. Those rocks tend to be smoother, have rounded edges, whereas the rocks up in that mountain stream are going to be real rough and rugged. So any physical force that's going to basically allow some of these rocks to be broken down and pulverized and so forth, worn away, that can affect the texture of the soil. All right. The nutrient content is kind of tied to the rocks themselves. What type of rock was it? All right, what was the chemical makeup of that rock that is undergoing these physical forces, the breakdown and so forth? Living organisms and decomposition also contributes to our nutrient content and can contribute to the texture. So if you think about it, you have plants can colonize, they can grow, and then they're going to die and they're going to break down. How quickly they break down is going to be tied to the organisms that are there, and those organisms determine how much of those nutrients get released and how quickly those nutrients get released. So these two things, the physical forces and then the living organisms, both play a role in the nutrient content and texture of our soils. The chemical content is often tied to weathering and deposition. So the weathering is also kind of like our erosion type stuff, but now with our deposition, we had some weathering or some erosion event that's happening, and it's going to carry those rock particles to some other place. So rivers flooding and leaving their silt over farmland, that's deposition. It's going to change our chemical content in that region. So the parent material could say this is what our soils should look like, but because of deposition, this is what it actually does look like. Wind patterns can do the same thing. Wind can erode rocks, and then wind can carry that to a completely different location. Example, on the south, what's that? Yeah, sandstorms, definitely. Going to carry a bunch of stuff. Kind of an extreme case, kind of where I grew up, outside of Chicago, so northwest Indiana, south shore of Lake Michigan, we have dunes, sand dunes. And those sand particles are the same type as the particles found in the Sahara Desert. And it's thought that there was some massive sandstorm that gathered these sand particles from the Sahara Desert, got it up into the upper atmosphere, and then brought them down in that area. That's at least one idea, but kind of interesting if you think about it. All right, so climate and substrate. That's ultimately going to be what determines our species ranges. But that's not, there's a difference between what we would consider a potential range and an actual range. All right, so our species ranges, the potential ranges are going to be determined by the physical conditions. by the abiotic environments. That's what they're going to be determined by. The law of tolerances. All right? You've got your precipitation, you have your climate, you have your substrates. That sets up the parameters and says, okay, if our organism can survive these conditions, then our organism can be there. But we're not done. Just because an organism can live there doesn't mean we actually see it there. All right? The actual range is also going to be determined by our biological interactions. All right? So you've got this potential range where the abiotic and physical conditions say an organism can live, but then it's our biological interactions that ultimately determine whether or not that individual can be there. This is a process called ecological filtering. All right, and I have this flow diagram, came from the book, that kind of demonstrates this. So first up, you can ask, can the species tolerate the physical conditions, yes or no? If they can't, then you have to ask, well, can they move to a different location? And if they can't move, if they're non-mobile, then no, they can't survive. They won't be there. But if they can move, then they're going to move to a new area where they can survive. All right? And when they find that new habitat that has a suitable physical conditions, then you have to look at what else is there and say, are there positive interactions happening or are there negative interactions happening? If there's positive interactions happening, then that organism could potentially live there, and that could be an actual range. If there's negative interactions going on, then you probably won't see that organism. So we're going to go back to our board and just kind of demonstrate that, or at least diagram, what we're talking about. So we have, let's say this, that's our potential range. Our species can live anywhere in this area. Conditions are great. But then when we go out, we don't see our organism in these areas. All right? Let's say that we only find our organism in this shaded region, or this hatched region. All right? So this outer one is our potential range. This region is our actual range. All right, so we've got our potential range, we have our actual range. Why is this our actual range? Two different possibilities. One, our organism hasn't made it there to that potential range yet. So it's limited by its movement, by its dispersal. Given enough time, we may get there. We may get there. Given enough time, we may get there. Or perhaps given enough time, this potential range contracts. Who knows? That's why on this slide I had that third dimension, time. The effect that our environment can change. That can play a role. Second reason why we might not be in this region here is because of our biological interactions. We could be due to a competitor. Maybe our species has a closely related species. So maybe during the time of glaciation, all right, we had a split. You had allopatric speciation take place. All right, you had your glacier that came down and split our population in two. They kind of went on their own evolutionary path. So now we have species 1 and species 2. They have basically the same range, but they're competitors, and one competitor is better than the other, and it lives in this region here. So its range, perhaps, includes all of this area. So that guy lives here, and it excludes the species that we're interested in. That's an example of a negative biological interaction. Perhaps on the other side, we have a predator, or we have a pathogen. Something that's going to take out our species. And if they're at high enough numbers, they're going to selectively consume them that prevents the expansion, we'll say the westerly expansion, of our species of interest. That is also a negative biological interaction. All right, so we've gone from our species and perhaps the global, the entire Earth could be a potential range, and then we filter it down based on physical conditions that gets us our potential range, and our biological interactions that gives us our actual range. And time represents that third axis, that third dimension, because these ranges, the potential ranges and the actual ranges, are going to be expanding and contracting and changing as our environment changes. All right, so ecological filtering is basically this idea, this concept, that membership of a community is limited by the abiotic and the biotic factors that are out there. All right, so our physical environment is going to filter our species based on their tolerance limits. That's our law of tolerance. Then the biological interactions will either inhibit or promote the presence of our species. Now, we didn't really talk about promotion, but perhaps some other individual, some other species, maybe the food source of our species, can grow in this area. And if that food source is there, well, our species can also live there at that point. What about disturbances? So disturbances, I haven't mentioned it. Disturbances can also play a role. I wouldn't necessarily call the disturbances a physical factor. And I wouldn't call it something that is where we can kind of like include it on the law of tolerance graph. But disturbances are real, and they can also affect our actual species ranges. How? Well, they can act as an ecological filter too. So it's not just the physical factors and the biological interactions. We also have to consider disturbances, because the disturbances can come in and remove species, prevent them from becoming established. Example is grassland fires. All right? In the plains, all right, in a grassland, all right, you don't have trees coming up. You don't see the trees coming up. Why is that? Well, because there's regular disturbances, and that disturbance that we're talking about is grassland fires. So the grassland fires, because they are periodic, because they come through, they exclude these larger trees from coming in and taking over and transforming that grassland into a forest. All right, we can probably come up with other examples as well. We can just say farmland. I mean, the disturbances, harvesting and plowing, right? Tilling up the soil. That is a disturbance. I mean, it's human caused, human induced disturbance, but that's a disturbance. And we do that. We have an effect on the ranges at that point. So it can act as an ecological filter, and it can influence the intensity of other filters. So we can alter our interactions, the biological interactions that could take place. So the example that I have here is with these fires, we're returning nutrients back to the soils. All right? And by returning those nutrients back to the soils, we could be replacing a limiting nutrient that was under high competition, or in normal cases would be very high competition for that resource. But the fires have kind of relieved that competition because that resource now doesn't become limiting, which means some other resource becomes limiting. And now that competition is for that other limiting resources. That can then influence that type of biological interaction. Is it a positive interaction? Is it a negative interaction? And so forth. All right, so our species ranges, physical factors, biological interactions, and then also have to consider disturbances. These are all things that kind of filter, go from the big picture, the Earth-like picture, all right? And we filter our ranges down until we actually get to our actual species ranges. All right, so let's go over a summary of this. What we've covered here. All right, so our species geographic range is going to be determined by our climates, by our substrates, and by the local biological interactions. We talked about all of those. You know, we can ask about, you know, how does climate affect it? How does substrates affect our species? How do the interactions affect our species, and so forth? For the climate was focused on our temperatures and precipitation patterns. All right. So how the temperature varies, how the precipitation varies, ultimately defines our climate. The climate then reflects the, you know, what we see is going to be modified by the local geographic features. All right, so it's not just latitude. Right, that's kind of like our broad view, but altitude is going to play a role. Right? If we have a mountain slope, the aspects are going to play a role. Our proximity to large bodies of water is going to play a role. All right. So these things we already talked about is how they affect our climate. For our substrates, we're talking about soils. Right? We're talking about what our plants are going to be growing in. And the soils and the soil types are a product of our weathered parent material. So weathering, breaking down of the rocks and stuff. Our external inputs, which mean, you know, the deposition. You know, when things get left and get carried and transported to a different area, as well as the organic matter. So what's been growing, how much stuff has been growing there and dying and decomposing and so forth. And then last part of it was dealing with this ecological filter. Dispersal and time ultimately determine whether a species can reach a favorable region. So we have, you know, the potential region and we have our actual region, but it's going to also be limited by dispersal. So perhaps our organism didn't make it there. All right? Perhaps they will, given enough time. Or perhaps our organism just physically can't because they're a sessile organism. Plants are limited in their movement based on the seed dispersal. Right? They can't just get up and walk away. The other thing is that perhaps this potential range actually became a potential range. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe, let's say, 5-10 years ago, our potential range ended right here. But because environment changed, because of changes in our climate or changes in physical conditions here, our potential range expands. All right? So things can, potential range can expand and contract based on time. And also, perhaps our species used to be there. Perhaps it used to be here, but then went locally extinct. And why would it have gone locally extinct? Could be due to another competitor. It could be due to a predator or disease or parasites. Or it could just be dumb luck that it happened. It just hit some bad situation, extreme fire that went through, extreme, you know, weather event that happened at that one time. Who knows? All those things are just up to random chance. Any questions? Nope. All right, if you do have questions, feel free to email me or bring them to class on Friday. Again, if you have questions as you review this stuff, feel free to email me, and what I'll do that next class is I'll answer that question in class because somebody else may have the same types of questions. All right. Next up, what we're going to do is look at the aquatic world. So talk about lakes, some oceans, and talk about the variation there. Same general pattern, I mean latitudinal variations, but the aquatic environment also we have to consider light. That plays a pretty big role. All right? All right. I'll get our quiz finished and get it posted, and I think we'll probably have that quiz due by the end of Monday. All right? By the end of Monday. All right. Have a good one.